This is a translation and expansion of the paper that I gave at Bernard Stiegler's Summer Academy in August of this year, 2012. The title is Ontology Making Us Stupid? I'll just read a short summary. I begin by deconstructing the title and explaining that Feyerabend does not really use the word ontology, because he's the hero of the paper. The bad guys are Altazarianism and Graham Harmon, and I end up with Feyerabend. So Feyerabend doesn't use the word ontology, though he does call his position sometimes, and the sometimes is important, ontological realism. I explained that he talks about his position as, indifferently, a general methodology or a general cosmology, and he seems to be hostile to the very enterprise of ontology, conceived of as a school philosophy. I then go on to say that there is perhaps a concept of a different kind of ontology that I call diachronic ontology, that perhaps Feyerabend would have accepted, and that is very different from ontology as it is ordinarily thought, which I call synchronic ontology, that is to say, having no room for the dialogue with being, but just supposing that being is already and always there without our contribution. I discuss Altazarianism and Graham Harmon as exemplifying synchronic ontology, and I give a reading of Graham Harmon's recent book, The Third Table. I think it's a good thing to give a reading of this book because Graham Harmon doesn't talk about it and his friends don't talk about it, and I really think it deserves more publicity. It's really cheap. You can get it in an ebook version, and it's really fast and pleasant read, so I really recommend that people read it. I then discuss Feyerabend's ideas as showing a different way, that of a diachronic ontology, in which there is no stable framework and no fixed path. I end with Andrew Pickering, whose essay New Ontologies makes a similar distinction to mine, expressing it in the imagistic terms of a de Koonigian, or what I call diachronic, versus a Mondrianesque, or what I call synchronic, approach. So, is ontology making us stupid? The question, is ontology making us stupid, is in reference to Nicholas Carr's book, The Shallows, which is an elaboration of his earlier essay, Is Google Making Us Stupid? And I will break the suspense by giving you the answer right away. Yes and no. Yes, ontology can make us more stupid, so it's a question of degree, if it privileges the synchronic, and I will give two examples. One, the Marxist ontology of Louis Althusser, and two, the object-oriented ontology of Graham Harmon. No, on the contrary, it can make us less stupid if it privileges the diachronic, and here I will give the example of the pluralist ontology of Paul Feyerabend. So obviously I include people like Levi Bryant in the category of those who are proposing or propounding or proclaiming a synchronic ontology. That is to say, regression in comparison with the last 35 years of work of deconstruction and pluralizing the dogmatic edifice that the Altazarians and Lacanians put up in the 70s or late 60s as well. Normally, I should give a little definition of ontology, the study of being as being, or the study of the most fundamental categories of beings, or the general theory of objects and their relations. However, This paper ends with a presentation of the ideas of Paul Feyerabend, and it must be noted that Feyerabend himself does not use the word ontology, preferring instead to talk indifferently of general cosmology or of general methodology. He does use the adjective ontological, as we shall see, but doesn't normally talk about ontology explicitly, although it's clear that that is one of the possible names for what he's doing. Sometimes as well he talks of the underlying system of categories of a worldview. And towards the end of his life he began to talk of being with a capital B, but he always emphasized that we should not get hung up on one particular word or approach, because there is no stable framework which encompasses everything, and that any name or argument or approach only, and I quote, accompanies us on our journey without tying it to a fixed road, unquote. This is from Feyerabend's letter to the reader at the beginning of the 4th edition of Against Method, and I give the link in the PDF of my paper where you can find this really interesting preface for free online. Feyerabend explicitly indicated that his own deconstructive approach derived from his fidelity to this ambiguity and this fluidity. Deconstructive is a word that Feyerabend uses in his autobiography and in various places. He considered that what he did was a form of deconstruction that was less pompous than Derrida's deconstruction, although he found that there were affinities between his ideas and those of Derrida, and that emphasized even further the ambiguity of all our basic words. Thus, ontology for Feyerabend implies a journey, that is to say, a process of individuation, without a fixed road and without a stable framework. And the OOO people are each in their own way, which is quite amazing, trying to propose a stable framework, at least of words, if not of concepts, because I think there are not too many concepts in OOO, and a fixed road. As for stupid, it refers to a process of what we could call stupidification, or dumbing down, or disindividuation, that tends to impose on us just such a fixed road and stable framework. The word making also calls for explanation. We are, according to Bernard Stiegler and to Aristotle, we are noetic creatures, and so the good news is that we can never be completely stupid, although some people come close to it, or completely disindividuated, except in the case of brain death. The bad news is that we can always become stupider than we are today, just as, luckily, we can always become more open, more fluid, more multiple, more differentiated, in short, more individuated. This is what I'm trying to do with my blog, with my videos, with the podcast that I'm going to be starting up very soon. Just individuating myself as much as possible and inviting others to individuate themselves with me. Ontology is not a magic wand that can transform us into an animal or a god, but it can favorize one or the other fork of the bifurcation of paths. So my argument will be very simple. Traditional ontologies are based on an approach to the real that privileges the synchronic dimension, where the paths are fixed and the framework is stable. Altazar and Graham Harmon, and I would add Levi Bryant, are good examples of synchronic ontology. Another type of ontology is possible, and it exists sporadically, which privileges the diachronic dimension, and thus the aspects of plurality and becoming. The paths here are multiple, and the framework is fluid. Feyerabend is a good example of a diachronic ontology. Obviously, there are other examples like Gilles Deleuze and Pierre-Félix Guattari. Lyotard, in both his libidinal economy phase and in his ontology of phrases, if it really is an ontology of phrases, and what he means by phrases is a bit complicated, but I would say he's at least gesturing towards diachronic ontology. And we could add maybe Derrida a little, Bernard Stiegler certainly, and a few others. I trace it all back to Ernst Mach and to Nietzsche. So I must note that for the sake of brevity, I talk of synchronic and of diachronic ontologies, but in fact each type of ontology contains elements of the other type, and it is simply a matter of the primacy given to the synchronic over the diachronic, or the inverse. Philosophy is inseparable from a series of radical conversions where our comprehension of all that exists is transformed. In itself, such a capacity for conversion or radical paradigm change is a rather positive thing. A problem arises when this conversion amounts to a reduction of our vision and an impoverishment of our life. That is to say, if the conversion makes us stupid. My conversion to a diachronic ontology took place in 1972 when I read Feyerabend's Against Method. So this was the earlier, the first version, the essay version, which has several interesting developments that were left out of the later book. So I earnestly urge you to read the essay version and to read the fourth edition of Against Method. So in this, he gives an outline of a pluralist ontology and epistemology. On reading it, I was transported, transformed, converted. Unfortunately, at the same period, my philosophy department converted to a very different philosophy, Altazarianism. So, first I want to talk about Althusser and Altazarianism, because I think it's the philosophical ancestor of the type of approach that we see in Harmon and Bryant. In fact, 1973 was a year that marked a turning point between the diachronic tempest of the 60s and the synchronic return to order desired by the Altazarians. I am deliberately using the expression that Bernard Stiegler uses to describe the invention of metaphysics as it was put to work in Plato's Republic, where he talks about the diachronic tempest of the age before the invention of philosophy by Plato, where this new invention of metaphysics was in support of a project of synchronization of minds and behaviors. I was the unwilling and unconsenting witness of an attempt at such a synchronization on a small scale. My department, the Department of General Philosophy, sank into the dogmatic project explicitly announced as such. The people who belong to the department, graduate students and philosophy lecturers, were quite explicit about their goal, which was forming radical, that is to say Altazarian, intellectuals under the aegis of Altazarian Marxist science. A small number of Altazarian militants took administrative and intellectual control of the department, and by all sorts of techniques of propaganda, intimidation, harassment, and exclusion, forced all its members, or almost all, either to conform to the Altazarian party line or to leave. Intellectually, the Altazarians imposed an onto-epistemological meta-language in terms of which they affirmed the radical difference between science and ideology, and also the scientificity of Marxism. It's customary to describe Altazarianism from the epistemological point of view, but it also had an ontological dimension, thanks to its distinction between real objects and theoretical objects. Scientific practice produces, according to them, its own objects, theoretical objects, as a means of knowing the real objects. The objects of everyday life, the objects of common sense, and even perceptual objects are not real objects, but ideological constructions, simulacra, as Harmon will later claim they are, in his words, utter shams. Faced with this negative conversion of an entire department, I tried to resist. Because I am counter-suggestible, as Feyerabend claimed to be, in other words, because I am faithful to the process of individuation rather than to a party line. Unlike some people, I'm not a joiner. I don't join a philosophical movement like some people have joined OOO, who joined Lacanian psychoanalysis before and were in fact trained as analysts, so have a life made of joining and never really deconverting, but sort of trying to accumulate their joining conversions. Anyhow, I'm pretty counter-suggestible, so I devoted myself to a critique of Altazarianism, which was a bad career move, let's face it, but I knew it. Its rudimentary ontology, the determination of being in terms of real objects, corresponds to a transcendental point of view of first philosophy, which acts as a hindrance to scientific practice and pre-constrains the type of theoretical construction that it can elaborate. To maintain the diachronicity of the sciences, one cannot retain the strict demarcation between real objects and theoretical objects, nor between science and ideology. The sciences, once we realize that, risk being demoted to the same plane as any other ideological construction and having their objects demoted to the status of simulacra. This is a step that the Altazarians did not take. They were very much afraid of and did everything that they could to avoid that conclusion. But it's a step that, as we shall see, Harmon does take, thus relieving the sciences of their privileged status, which is one of the good things about Harmon. I must note the set of interviews with Jacques Derrida, Politics and Friendship, describes the same phenomenon of intellectual pretension and intimidation, supported by a theory having an aura of epistemological and ontological sophistication, but which was radically deficient. Derrida emphasizes that the concepts of object and of objectivity were deployed without sufficient analysis of their pertinence, nor of their theoretical and practical utility and groundedness. So that was Derrida's reaction to Altazarianism, and I think the same analysis applies almost word for word to Graham Harmon's OOO today. After the period of Altazarian hegemony came a new period of diachronic storm, this time on the intellectual plane. Translations came out of works by Foucault and Derrida and Kristeva and Irigaray and Baudrillard and all sorts of people, including Lyotard and Deleuze, who particularly interested me, and Michel Serres. Altazarian dogmas were contested and deconstructed. But for me, there still remain serious limitations on thought, despite this new sophistication. There was an ontological dimension common to all these authors, and this ontological dimension was either neglected or ignored by the defenders of French theory. Feyerabend himself seemed, at least to me, to be in need of an ontology to reinforce his pluralism and to protect it against dogmatic incursions of the Altazarian type and against relativist dissolutions of the postmodern type. I taught myself French to read these French theorists because not enough was being translated. And then I was lucky. I obtained a scholarship to go and study in Paris. And I left Australia in 1980 to continue my ontological and epistemological research. What I retained from this experience, over and above the need to maintain and to push forward the deconstruction by elaborating a new sort of ontology to accompany its advances, is the feeling of disappointment with the contradictory sophistication in Altazarian philosophy. I had the impression that it pluralized and diachronized with one hand what it reduced and synchronized with the other. Thus, despite its initial show of sophistication, it made its acolytes stupid, disindividuated. Further, as an instrument of synchronization on the large scale, it was doomed to failure by its Marxism and its scientism, both of which made securing its general adoption an impossible mission. It would have been necessary to demarxize and descientize its theory to make it acceptable to the greatest number. Further, its diffusion was limited to the academic microcosm because at that time there was no internet. These limitations to the theory's propagation, Marxism, scientism, academic confinement, have been deconstructed and overcome by a new philosophical movement called, or calling itself, object-oriented ontology, OOO, which has conquered a new sort of philosophical public. Lastly, I retain a distrust of any movement in philosophy and of the power tactics, propaganda, intimidation, harassment, exclusion, just sheer ignoring that are inevitably implied. Oblivious to this sort of wariness with respect to the sociology of Homo academicus, the Oxians published or publicized themselves as a movement and attribute the rapid diffusion of their ideas to their mastery of digital social technologies. They're quite proud of it. My next part concerns Harmon and Graham Harmon, because there is a fairly good philosopher called Gilbert Harmon, but I'm talking about Graham Harmon. Harmon and object-oriented ontology. In the third table, Graham Harmon gives a brief summary of the principal themes of his object-oriented ontology. It's a little book published this year, 2012, in a bilingual English and German edition, and the English text occupies a little over 11 pages. The content is quite engaging, as Harmon accomplishes the exploit of presenting his principal ideas in the form of a response to Sir Arthur Eddington's famous two tables argument. This permits him to formulate his arguments in terms of a continuous polemic against reductionism in both its humanistic and scientific or scientistic forms. All that is fine as far as it goes. However, problems arise when we examine his presentation of each of Eddington's two tables, and even more so with his presentation of his own contribution to the discussion, the eponymous third table, the only real one in Harmon's eyes. In the introduction to his book, The Nature of the Physical World, which you can download for free from archive.org, Eddington begins with an apparent paradox. I have just settled down to the task of writing these lectures and have drawn up my chairs to my 2 tables. 2 tables, yes! There are duplicates of every object about me. 2 tables, 2 chairs, 2 pens. Eddington explains that there is the familiar object, the table as a substantial thing, solid and reliable, against which I can lean and support myself. But according to him, modern physics speaks of a quite different table. I quote, "My scientific table is mostly emptiness. Sparsely scattered in that emptiness are numerous electric charges rushing about with great speed." Unquote. Eddington contrasts the substantiality of the familiar table, a solid thing, easy to visualize as such, and the abstraction of the scientific table, mostly empty space, a set of physical measures related by mathematical formulae. The familiar world of common sense is, according to him, a world, on this view, because not really according to him, Harmon gets that wrong. The familiar world of common sense is a world of illusions, whereas the scientific world, the only real world according to modern physics, and not to Eddington, is a world of shadows. What is the relation between the 2 worlds? Eddington poses the question and dramatizes the divergence between the 2 worlds. But contrary to what Harmon seems to think, he gives no answer of his own. He declares that premature attempts to determine their relation are harmful, more of a hindrance than a help, to research. In fact, Eddington refuses to commit himself on the ontological question posed in his introduction because he is convinced that it is empirical research, mobilizing psychology and physiology as well as physics, so transversal research, which must give the answer. It is clear that he would have regarded Altazarianism as just such a premature and harmful attempt. But what would he have thought of Harmon's OOO? We shall return to this question in the last part of this talk. In his little text, Harmon explains very succinctly the difference between the 2 tables. But in opposition to Eddington's supposed scientism, Harmon affirms that these 2 tables are equally unreal. So both the scientific and the common sense table are, according to Harmon, equally unreal. He affirms that they are just fakes or simulacra, what he calls utter shams, page 6 on the 3rd table. Assigning each table to one side of the gap that separates the famous 2 cultures, dear to C.P. Snow, the culture of the humanities on one side, that of the sciences on the other, he finds that both are products of reductionism, which negates the reality of the table. I quote from Harmon, "The scientist reduces the table downward to tiny particles invisible to the eye. The humanist reduces it upward to a series of effects on people and other things." So this is a really neat example in Harmon's eyes of the 2 types of reductionism, undermining in the case of physics, overmining in the case of the humanities or common sense. It's not really clear. He sort of moves around a lot in the book for his definition of what the overmining case is. Refusing reductionism and its simulacra, Harmon poses the existence of a 3rd table, the only real table, page 10, which serves as an emblem for a 3rd culture to come, whose paradigm could be taken from the arts, which attempt to, and I quote, establish objects deeper than the features through which they are announced, or allude to objects that cannot quite be made present. Page 14 in the 3rd table. Philosophy itself is to abandon its scientific pretensions in order to speak at last of the real world and its objects. In Word and Object, Willard van Orman Quine proposes a technique called Semantic Ascent to resolve certain problems in philosophy. He invites us to formulate our philosophical problems no longer in material terms, as questions concerning the components of the world, objects, but rather in formal terms, as questions concerning the correct use and the correct analysis of our linguistic expressions, words in the title. The idea was to find common ground to discuss impartially the pretensions of rival points of view. Unfortunately, this method turned out to be useless to resolve most problems, as the important disputes concern just as much the terms to employ and their interpretation as soon as we take up an interesting philosophical problem. So, Graham Harmon seems to have had the idea to inverse that path. With his new ontology, he proposes a veritable semantic descent, or we could call it an objectal descent, to reverse the linguistic turn and to replace it with an ontological turn. According to him, the fundamental problems of ontology must be reformulated in terms of objects and their qualities. These objects are not the objects of our familiar world. Let us recall that Harmon declares that the familiar table, as the emblem of familiar common sense objects, is unreal, a simulacrum, an utter sham. The real object is a philosophical object which, and I quote, withdraws behind all its external effects. Page 10. We cannot touch the Harmonian table because we can never touch any real object, and we cannot know it either. The real is something that cannot be known but only loved. So Harmons Solution is to love the table. Thus, Harmon operates a reduction of the world to objects and their qualities, which is intended to be, in the first instance, ontological and not epistemological. Here, Harmon is mistaken, and the epistemological dimension is omnipresent in his work. But it is the object, unfortunately for him, not for us, it's the object of a denegation, a denial. This objectal reduction is difficult to argue for, and sometimes it's presented just as a self-evident truth, accessible to every person of goodwill and good sense. He talks about bankers, and I can't remember who. I hope the quote is here. And Harmon's philosophy is trumpeted as a return to naivete and concreteness, triumphing over post-structuralist pseudo-sophistication and its abstractions. But as we shall see, this is not the case. This reduction of the world to objects and their qualities amounts to a conversion of our philosophical vision that is disguised, and that's the case, it's disguised, it's advertised as a return to the real world of concrete objects. Here's the quote. Instead of beginning with radical doubt, we start from naivete. What philosophy shares with the lives of scientists, bankers, and animals is that all are concerned with objects. This is great. This is from the quadruple object, page 5. And once again, once we begin from naivete rather than doubt, objects immediately take center stage. So, this self-evidence of the point of view of naivete is in fact meticulously constructed and highly philosophically motivated. We should recall that Harmon's objects are not at all the objects of common sense. We can't know them and we can't touch them. So we can't hear them, we can't see them, we can't smell them. They're not objects of the senses at all. So the naivete that Harmon invokes here is not some primitive openness to the world that would only be, if it were the case, variant of the bucket theory of mind and of knowledge, denounced by Karl Popper, an epistemologist that Harmon probably should have read because he spent 12 years reading Heidegger, so maybe he should have condensed that a little and read a little epistemology as well. Anyhow, this naivete is a determinant point of view, a very particular perspective, the naive point of view, as the French translation so aptly calls it. So Harmon has been really elogious. He's really praised the French translation of the quadruple object, and the translator decided to translate naivete, which is the same in French and English, as the naive point of view, to accentuate what Harmon doesn't seem to notice or want us to notice, that this naivete is in fact a particular point of view and not just some brute givenness obvious to everyone. So I think I've written this on my blog. I think that the translation into French of the quadruple object is better than the original, although, I mean, the style is a lot better. I think the author's name is Olivier Dubouclès. He has a really good style in French, so stylistically it's improved. Sometimes it's a little clearer, but unfortunately sometimes it sort of gives away what is hidden in or withdrawn in the French. So under cover of the word naivete, Harmon talks to us of a naive point of view that is nevertheless, I mean it's naive, but it's nevertheless objectal. So not naive at all, but partisan. Harmon deploys all his rhetorical resources to provoke in the reader the adoption of the objectal point of view as if it were self-evident. This objectal conversion is necessary, according to him, to at last get out of the tyranny of epistemology and the linguistic turn and edify a new ontology, a new foundation for a metaphysics capable of speaking of all objects. And he's been embraced by artists when not noticing that we can't see the objects, we can't touch them, we can't smell them, we can't even know whether something is an object or not, has declared Harmon. I don't even know how we would think about a possible candidate for an object, because they're totally different from sensual objects and they're unknowable as well. So I think his success has been in non-philosophical circles, has been based on very dramatic misunderstanding, but that's the way the world goes. Anyhow, we have seen that this self-evident beginning implies both a conversion, that's normal, a new philosophy implies a conversion, which can imprison you or can open you, and a reduction, so there's a stupidification going on. We see the parallels and differences of object-oriented ontology in relation to Altazarianism. Both relegate the familiar object and the perceptual object to the status of social constructions. OOO goes even further and assigns the scientific object to the same status of simulacrum, utter sham. Only philosophy can tell us the truth about objects. Both Altazarianism and OOO propose a meta-language, but OOO's meta-language is so dequalified that it is susceptible of different instantiations. And in fact, no two members of the movement have the same concrete ontology. So we can have a very sort of aristocratic, pure, non-naturalist ontology. That's one specification of the meta-ontology. That's Harmon's. We can have a sort of more leftist, quite strange, nostalgic, radical, chic, Lacano, Altazarian, with a bit of Badiou mixed in ontology. That's Levi Bryant's ontology. I'm talking about the real framework of his ontology. He can drop as many names as he wants from recent books, Kim Sterelny and I don't know who, but that's got nothing to do with the structure of his ontology, which is an instantiation of this same basic meta-ontology. Finally, OOO spreads itself in making abundant, liberal, and here the word liberal seems quite appropriate, use of the means that the internet makes available: blogs, discussion groups, Facebook exchanges, Twitter, Empire, podcasts, streaming. These things are not bad. Lots of people use them, and to quite good effect. But this is one of their progresses in relation to Althusser, and a way of breaking out of academic confinement, which I think is a good thing. Unfortunately, on the base of what I've described as a dramatic misunderstanding. I have spoken here principally of Graham Harmon's OOO because I do not believe that OOO exists in general, and I also think that its apparent unity is a deceitful facade. There is no substance to the movement. It's rather a matter of agreement on a shared meta-language, that is to say, on a shared terminology and set of themes and ritual phrases and references. So the object withdrawals means totally different things for Harmon and for Levi Bryant. Harmon is really in favor of Husserl and recommends to Levi Bryant to read more Husserl. Levi Bryant condemns Husserl to the idealist flames of hell. So there's quite a lot of difference at the content level, or the object level if you want, but these same ritual phrases and terms and references crop up again and again, and that's what gives unity to the movement. I've spoken here almost exclusively of the third table because Harmon's formulations change from book to book, and I find that in this little brochure Harmon offers us his meta-language in a pure state. In his other books, Harmon, without noticing, slides constantly between the meta-ontological sense of object and sense which corresponds to one possible instantiation of this meta-language, thus producing much conceptual confusion. I think it's this going without noticing or without signaling between the meta-ontological sense of object and a concrete instantiation of this sense of this meta-ontology that has led to the confusion that here we have a philosophy that is at last talking about the objects in the real world, which, as I recall, unseeable, unsmellable, unhearable, untouchable, unknowable, but you can love them. Absence makes the heart grow fonder, or withdrawal makes the heart grow fonder. My major objection to Harmon's OOO is that it is a school philosophy dealing in generalities and abstractions, far from the concrete joys and struggles of real human beings. Another quote from the third table, page 12. The world is filled primarily not with electrons or human praxis, but with ghostly objects withdrawing from all human and inhuman access. Unquote. It's a real ascesis to love something like that. Despite its promises, Harmon's OOO does not bring us closer to the richness and complexity of the real world, but in fact replaces the multiplicitous and variegated world with a set of bloodless and lifeless abstractions, his unknowable and untouchable ghostly objects. That's his word. Not only are objects unknowable, but even whether something is a real object or not is unknowable. Quote, we can never know for sure what is a real object and what isn't. Unquote. Yet, Harmon has legislated that his object is the only real object. See the third table, where Harmon calls his table as compared to the table of everyday life and the scientist table. There are several examples or instances, so it's not just a slip. He calls it the only real one, with italics on real, page 10, the only real table, page 11. As for the everyday table and the scientific table, both are equally unreal, both are utter shams. Whatever we capture, this is another quote from page 12, whatever we capture, whatever we sit at or destroy, is not the real table. To say that the real object is unknowable, the real is something that cannot be known, page 12, is an epistemological thesis, strangely enough. I don't know why he didn't notice that, but we can't notice everything. As is the claim that the object we know, always this reference to knowledge, but epistemology is bad. So, the thesis that the object we know, the everyday or the scientific object, is unreal is also an epistemological thesis. It's both. It's ontological and it's epistemological. It's really hard to find cases where you can sort of separate the two totally out, and Harmon's whole philosophy is based on mixing the two together totally intimately, but denying any validity to the epistemological point of view. The primacy is ontology that has been, according to him, freed from the epistemological turn. My question is, how can this help our lives? It's a doctrine of resignation and passivity. We cannot know the real object. The object that we do know is unreal, an utter sham. We cannot know what is or isn't a real object. Harmon's objects then do not withdraw, as he claims. They transcend. They transcend our perception and our knowledge. They transcend all relations and interactions. As Harmon reiterates, objects are deep. I quote, "Objects are deeper than their appearance to the human mind, but also deeper than their relations to one another." Page 4. The real table is a genuine reality, deeper than any theoretical or practical encounter with it, deeper than any relations in which it might become involved. Page 9 and 10. This depth is a key part of Harmon's ontology, which is not flat at all, and is the negation of immanence. Rather, it is centered on this vertical dimension of depth and transcendence. But with the hocus pocus of the word withdraw, he hopes people won't notice it. Maybe. Some people don't seem to notice it. Harmon practices a form of ontological critique, which contains both relativist elements and dogmatic elements. So there are parts of Harmon that I quite like. At the level of explicit content, Harmon is freer, less dogmatic than Altazar, and I would add than Levi Bryant, as he does not make science the queen of knowledge. There's a Feyerabedian aspect to Harmon that I find quite congenial. Harmon situates himself insistently after the linguistic turn, after the so-called epistemologies of access, after deconstruction, and after post-structuralism. That's what he claims. He considers that the time for construction has come, that we must construct a new philosophy by means of a return to the things themselves of the world. That is to say, a return to objects. But is this the case? Now I want to talk about Feyerabend and the harmfulness of the ontological turn. Feyerabend stands in opposition to this demand for a new construction and wholeheartedly espouses the continued necessity of deconstruction. He rejects the idea that we need a new system or theoretical framework, arguing that in many cases a unified theoretical framework is just not necessary or even useful. I quote, "A theoretical framework may not be needed. Do I need a theoretical framework to get along with my neighbor? Even a domain that uses theories may not need a theoretical framework. In periods of revolution, theories are not used as frameworks, but are broken into pieces, which are then arranged this way and that way until something interesting seems to arise." This is taken from another interesting essay that you can find on the internet, "Philosophy and Methodology of Military Intelligence," a series of letters between Feyerabend and an expert in military intelligence who wanted to apply Feyerabend's ideas to this domain. Further, not only is a unified framework often unnecessary, it can be a hindrance to our research and to the conduct of our lives. Frameworks, quote, frameworks always put undue constraints on any interesting activity," unquote. He emphasizes that our ideas must be sufficiently complex to fit in and to cope with the complexity of our practices. More important than a new theoretical construction, which only serves to confuse people instead of helping them, we need ideas that have the complexity and the fluidity that comes from close connection with concrete practice and with its fruitful imprecision. Lacking this connection, we get only school philosophies that deceive people but do not help them. They deceive people by replacing the concrete world with their own abstract construction that gives some general and very misleading outlines but never descends to details. This is a good description of Harmon's and Bryan's works. The result is a simplistic set of slogans and stereotypes that, I quote, "is taken seriously only by people who have no original ideas and think that such a school philosophy might help them to get ideas," unquote. Applied to the ontological turn, this means that an ontological system is useless, a hindrance to thought and action, whereas an ontology which is not crystallized into a system of principles, but which limits itself to an open set of rules of thumb and of free study of concrete cases, is both acceptable and desirable. The detour through ontology is useless because, according to Feyerabend, a more open and less technical approach is possible. In effect, Feyerabend indicates what Ennington could have replied to Harmon. Just like Altazarianism, OOO must be considered a premature and harmful failure because it specifies in an a priori and dogmatic fashion what the elements of the world are, objects. This failure is intrinsic to its transcendental approach. It is premature because it prejudges the paths and results of empirical research. It is harmful because it tends to exclude possible avenues of research and to close people's minds, making them stupid. Stupid in this very technical sense that I take from Bernard Stiegler, which, as I've indicated, means disindividuated. Ennington's position is, in fact, very complex. He gives a dramatized description of what amounts to the incommensurability of the world of physics and the familiar world of experience. This is implicit in the whole theme that he develops of the necessary aloofness that scientific conceptions must maintain with respect to familiar conceptions. He then goes on to pose the question of the relation or linkage between the two. Sometimes he seems to give primacy to the familiar world. For example, I quote, "The whole scientific inquiry starts from the familiar world, and in the end it must return to the familiar world," unquote. And, second quote, "Science aims at constructing a world which shall be symbolic of the world of commonplace experience," end of quote. Sometimes he gives primacy to the world of physics and seems to declare that the familiar world is illusory. For example, quote, "In removing our illusions, we have removed the substance, for indeed we have seen that the substance is one of our greatest illusions, unquote. Though he does attenuate this by adding, quote again, later perhaps we may inquire whether in our zeal to cut out all that is unreal, we may not have used the knife too ruthlessly, unquote. So Harmon, in that case, would be a philosopher not of the hammer, but of the ruthless knife. On the question of the relation between physics and philosophy, Eddington is no mere scientific chauvinist. Indeed, he gives a certain primacy to the philosopher. I quote, "The scientist has good and sufficient reasons for pursuing his investigations in the world of shadows, and is content to leave to the philosopher the determination of its exact status in regard to reality." End of quote. But he considers that neither common sense nor philosophy must interfere with physical science's freedom for autonomous development. His conclusion is that reflection on modern physics leads to, quote, "a feeling of open-mindedness towards a wider significance transcending scientific measurement," end of quote, and warns us against a priori closure. I quote, "After the physicist has quite finished his world building, a linkage or identification is allowed, but premature attempts at linkage have been found to be entirely mischievous." As we can see, Graham Harmon's discussion of this text in the third table makes a mess of Eddington's position, treating him as advocating the scientific primacy of the world of physics. This is a radical misreading. Harmon can then propose his solution. The objects of both common sense and physics are utter shams. The real object is that of his, Harmon's, philosophy. This is why I think that Harmon's OOO is a contemporary example of what Eddington calls premature attempts at linkage, and that he finds mischievous, that is to say, both failed and harmful. My thesis is that much of OOO is a badly flawed epistemology masquerading as an ontology. An interesting confirmation of this thesis is the touting of Roy Bhaskar's A Realist Theory of Science. For those too young to remember, this book came out initially in 1975, after the major epistemological works by Popper, Kuhn, Lakatos, Feyerabend, and a few others. It was an ontologizing reappropriation of their epistemological discoveries. So he didn't discover anything that these of the sort that these epistemologists discovered. He just took over their discoveries and expressed it in ontological terminology as if they were his own ontological discoveries. Does that sound like anyone? It was hailed as a great contribution by the Anglophone Altazarians, as it gave substance to their distinction between the theoretical object, produced by the theoretical practices of the sciences, and the real object. The Altazarians used Bhaskar to legitimate their posing of Altazarian Marxism and Lacanian psychoanalysis as sciences, which on any other basis was quite a difficult task to undertake. Their universal critique of any philosophical view that did not square with theirs was to disqualify it as demonstrably belonging, sometimes in very roundabout and tortuous ways, but nonetheless as corresponding to the problematic of the subject. Does this begin to sound familiar? The real object versus the theoretical object of science and of common sense, because our common sense is an ideological construct, and the condemnation of the problematic of the subject, which is virtually the same thing as Maya Su's idea of correlationism. These themes are not new, but go back to the dogmatic reaction of the 70s. It's amusing to see that Bhaskar, who is a prime example of someone who invented an ontological correlate to epistemological insights, is now being used as the proponent or the support of a non-correlationist, realist position to condemn those who supposedly give primacy to epistemology over ontology. The whole procedure is circular. That is to say, far from really asking, as he claims, the transcendental question of what must the world be like for science to be possible, this is in fact an ideological cover-up for the real historical stakes of Bhaskar's intervention. Bhaskar proceeds to an ontologization of insights and advances in epistemology, and so constrains future research with an a posteriori ontology projected backwards as if it were an a priori neutral precondition of science. So Harmon's supposed primacy of ontology is in fact based on his continual denegation of his de facto dependence on results imported from epistemology, and on the dogmatic freezing and imposition of what is at best only a particular historical stage of scientific research, if it exists, and of epistemological reflection. One of my biggest objections to OOO concerns the question of primacy, which remains moot in contemporary philosophy. As we have seen, Harmon's ontological turn gives primacy to transcendental, meta-level philosophy. Feyerabend articulates an Eddingtonian position, one that gives primacy neither to philosophy nor to physics, but defends the open-mindedness of empirical, though not necessarily scientific, research. I think this can be clarified by examining Feyerabend's defense of what he calls the way of the scientist as against the way of the philosopher. Feyerabend's references to Marx and to Pauli show that this way of the scientist is in fact transversal, not respecting the boundaries between scientific disciplines, nor those between the sciences and the humanities and the arts. So it is more properly called the way of research. And Eddington, under this definition, too, seems to espouse this Machian way out of the pitfalls of primacy. Ernst Mach is often seen as a precursor of the logical positivist, an exponent of the idea that things are logical constructions built up out of the sensory qualities that compose the world. Things are mere bundles of sensations. If that were true, he would be a key example of what Graham Harmon in The Quadruple Object calls overmining. But unfortunately for Graham Harmon, Feyerabend has shown in a number of essays that this vision of Marx's philosophy is in quotation marks, because according to Feyerabend, Marx refused to be regarded as the proponent of a new philosophy. Okay, so Feyerabend has shown that this vision of Marx's philosophy is erroneous, based on a misreading by the logical positivist that confounds his general ontology with one specific ontological hypothesis that Marx was at pains to describe as a provisional and research-relative specification of his more general proposal. So Marx is quite explicit about the difference between his meta-ontology and the possible instantiations of it. So contrary to the logical positivist image of Marx, the phenomenalist hypothesis, which some people take to be the be-all and end-all of Marx, is just one particular instantiation that is suggested in some circumstances. Following Ernst Mach, Feyerabend expounds the rudiments of what he calls a general methodology or a general cosmology. This ambiguity is important between methodology and cosmology, or what we could call ontology. Feyerabend, on general grounds, but also after a close scrutiny of several important episodes in the history of physics, proceeds as if there is no clear and sharp demarcation between ontology and epistemology, whereas Harmon, without the slightest case study, is convinced of the existence of such a dichotomy. Feyerabend's discussion of Marx's ontology can be found in Science in a Free Society, pages 196 to 203, and in many other places, making it clear that it is one of the enduring inspirations of his work. Marx's ontology can be summarized, according to Feyerabend, in 2 points. 1. The world is composed of elements and their relations. 2. The nature of these elements and their relations is to be specified by empirical research. So, one could note a resemblance with Harmon's ontology, summarized in a brief SROO tutorial online. 1. Individual entities of various scales are the ultimate stuff of the cosmos. 2. These entities are never exhausted by their relations. Objects withdraw from relation. The difference is illuminating, whereas Marx leaves the nature of these elements open, allowing for the exploration of several hypotheses, Harmon transcendentally reduces these possibilities to one. Elements are objects. That's all. Note, this reduction of the possibilities to one, enshrined in a transcendental principle, is one of the reasons for calling Harmon's OOO an objectal reduction. Further, by allowing empirical research to specify the relations, Marx does not give himself an a priori principle of withdrawal. Here again, withdrawal is just one possibility among many. Another advantage of this ontology of unspecified elements is that it allows us to do research across disciplinary boundaries, including that between science and philosophy. Feyerabend talks of Marx's ontology's disregard for distinctions between areas of research. Any method, any type of knowledge could enter the discussion of a particular problem. In my terminology, Marx's ontology is diachronic, evolving with and as part of empirical research. Harmon's ontology is synchronic, dictating and fixing transcendentally the elements of the world. Feyerabend uses most often a dialogical method, although he was led to complain that this was often a one-sided dialogue. Things haven't changed very much since then. This was because many of his philosophical reviewers were what he called illiterate, and what I am calling in this talk stupid, that is to say, instances of a dogmatic and decontextualized image of thought conjugated with a disindividuated academic professionalism. Of these failed dialogues, Feyerabend writes in Science in a Free Society, I published them, and I could say the same thing for my blog posts. I published them because even a one-sided debate is more instructive than an essay, and because I want to inform the wider public of the astounding illiteracy of some professionals. That's Feyerabend from Science in a Free Society, page 10. Fortunately, not all his dialogues were so one-sided. In his encounters with interlocutors, Feyerabend tends to function a little like a Zen master, trying to get people to change their attitude, to get them to sense chaos, in his terms, where they perceive an orderly arrangement of well-behaved things and processes. That's in his last letter. A very instructive example of this can be seen in his correspondence on military intelligence networks with Isaac Ben Israel over a two-year period stretching from September 1988 to October 1990. Though Feyerabend mainly refers to the philosophy of science, after all, it was his domain of specialization, he gives sporadic indications that his remarks apply to all philosophy, especially to all school philosophies, and not just to epistemology and the philosophy of the sciences. So it is possible to see in a very general way what Feyerabend's ideas on ontology are in this epistolary dialogue, which begins with considerations of school philosophy as a useless detour, comparing it unfavorably with a more naive, Feyerabend used the word, but I think legitimately here, to a more naive, unacademic, critical approach. So it's naive not in the sense that it's brute bucket awareness. It's naive only when measured by the criteria of academic specialization, because in fact this, as we shall see, this sort of naive critical approach has a different sort of sophistication because it comes from different areas outside the academic network. Feyerabend's first letter, page 5 and 6, talks about this more naive, unacademic critical approach, and goes on in letter 2 to consider in a little more detail what an unacademic critical philosophy would look like. Then, in letter 3, he proceeds to plead for the non-demarcation of the sciences and the arts humanities. Harmon we've seen as demarcating all over the place, and for the need to see epistemology and ontology as parts of politics, and culminates in letters 4 and 5 with a sketch of Feyerabend's own views on ontology. This is really an amazing document, and one of the reasons is the dialogue form takes Feyerabend into a domain that he has not discussed before, intelligence networks, and it permits a concise yet progressive exposition of his later ideas and of their fruitful imprecision. Feyerabend tells us that ontological critique, or the detour through ontology, is unnecessary because a more open and less technical approach is possible. He gives us various figurations of that unacademic approach: the educated layman, discoverers and generals, certain Kenyan tribes, a lawyer interrogating experts, the Homeric Greek worldview, his own minimalist ontology. The advantages he cites of such an unacademic approach are: 1, ability to work in partly closed surroundings, where there is a flow of information in some directions but not others. 2, action that is sufficiently complex to fit in to the complexity of our practices and of the real world. 3, ability to work without a fixed theoretical framework, to work outside well-defined frames, to break up frameworks and to rearrange the pieces as the circumstances demand, to not be limited by the undue constraints inherent to any particular framework. 4, ability to work not just outside the traditional prejudices of a particular domain, but outside the boundaries between domains, such as the putative boundary between the arts and the sciences. 5, an awareness of the political origins and consequences of seemingly apolitical academic subjects. Ontology, according to Feyerabend, without politics is incomplete and arbitrary. But one could object that Feyerabend is a relativist, and so that empirical research for him could give whatever results we want, because in his system anything goes. In fact, the best gloss of this polemical slogan is: anything could work, but mostly doesn't. So maybe anything goes is a sublimated version of Murphy's Law. If anything can go wrong, it will. Anyhow, Feyerabend's epistemological realism is supported by an ontological realism. I quote, "Reality, or being, has no well-defined structure, but reacts in different ways to different approaches." This is one reason why he sometimes refuses the label of relativist, because according to him, relativism presupposes a fixed framework. For Feyerabend, the transversality of communication between people belonging to apparently incommensurable structures shows that the notion of a frame of reference that is fixed and impermeable has only limited applicability. People with different ways of life and different conceptions of reality can learn to communicate with each other, says Feyerabend, often even without a Gestalt switch, which means, as far as I am concerned, that the concepts they use and the perceptions they have are not nailed down but are ambiguous. Nevertheless, he distinguishes between being as ultimate reality, which is unknowable, and the multiple manifest realities which are produced by our interaction with it and which are themselves knowable. Approach being in one way, across, nonetheless, decades of scientific experiment, and it produces elementary particles. Approach it in another way, over quite a long period of time, and it produces the Homeric gods. I quote, "I now distinguish between an ultimate reality, or being. Being cannot be known, ever. I have arguments for that. What we do know are the various manifest realities, like the world of the Greek gods, modern cosmology, etc. These are the results of an interaction between being and one of its relatively independent parts." End of quote. The difference with relativism is that there is no guarantee that the approach will work. Being is independent of us and must respond positively, which is very often not the case. Feyerabend draws the conclusion that the determination of what is real and what is a simulacrum cannot be the prerogative of an abstract ontology, and thus of the intellectuals who promulgate that abstract ontology. There is no fixed framework. The manifest realities are multiple, and being is unknowable. Thus, the determination of what is real depends on our choice in favor of one form of life or another. That is, it depends on a political decision. This leads to Feyerabend's conclusion: ontology without politics is incomplete and arbitrary. Inversely, Harmon has repeated many times that ontology has nothing to do with politics. Seen through Feyerabend's eyes, Harmon's OOO is thus both incomplete, because it is apolitical, and arbitrary, because it is a priori and monist. We have already said that, but also because it attributes to a little tribe of intellectuals the right to tell us what is real, Harmon's ghostly objects withdrawing from all human and inhuman access, and what is unreal, the simulacra of common sense, of the humanities and of the sciences, whatever we can see, hear, feel, smell, touch, know, all that is supposed to be unreal. It is also harmful because it is based on ghostly, bloodless, merely intelligible real objects that transcend any of the regimes and practices that give us qualitatively differentiated objects in any recognizable sense. Objects withdraw, that's the key word for Harmon, objects withdraw from the diverse truth regimes, the sciences, the humanities, common sense, religion and politics. That is, etymologically speaking, they abstract themselves. Real objects are abstractions, real objects in Harmon's sense. Indeed, they are abstraction itself. This is not a revolutionary new weird realism. How groovy can you get? This is regressive transcendent realism, cynically packaged as its opposite. I consider Harmon's OOO as a purified and, above all, consensualized, that is to say, de-Marxized, depoliticized, de-scientized version of Altazar's ontology of the real object and of his anti-humanism, and as exhibiting the same defects as any other synchronic ontology. Okay, now I come to the conclusion, which is probably a big relief. The structure of my argument is very classical and very abstract, as it remains wholly in the domain of philosophy, and even worse, in that of first philosophy. So to conclude, I would like to give some indications to show that these questions are, or can be, very practical. In his article New Ontologies, Andrew Pickering presents something like the two ontologies that I discuss in terms of the contrast between the painters de Kooning and Mondrian. Mondrian's paintings are examples of a synchronic approach, where the subject distances itself from the world in order to dominate it, according to a transcendent plan which imposes its abstract representations on a passive material. The painter foresees and imposes his order on everything. There's no room for surprises that emerge during the process of painting. The canvas does nothing. It is receptive rather than agentive. There's no exchange between the painter and his canvas, no dialogue. Dialogue, as we've seen, is not one of the strong points of OOO practices. On the other hand, de Kooning's canvases participate themselves in the elaboration of the work. There is a continual back and forth between the painter and his canvas, between the perception of emergent effects and the attempt to intensify them. The de Kooningian approach is diachronic. It involves an immanent, concrete, incarnated, open process of engagement in the world, whereas the Mondrianesque approach is synchronic and implies a transcendent, abstract, disincarnated, closed process of distanciation from the world. The Mondrianesque approach corresponds, according to Pickering, to Heidegger's enframing, while the de Kooningian approach practices aletheia, unveiling. Pickering's hope is that the diachronic practices, which are still marginal in our society, can come together and overflow or dissolve the dominant synchronic enframing. Pickering gives several concrete examples of diachronic practices, not only in art, with de Kooning, but also in civil engineering. He talks about the ecological and adaptive management of a river, and also in psychiatry, anti-psychiatric experiments like Kingsley Hall, institutional psychotherapy like Laborde, favorizing symmetric and non-hierarchical relations. He also talks of mathematics, music, and architecture to show in each case the concrete effects of both approaches. So we should keep in mind that even if the discussion in this paper is situated on the conceptual plane, the differences and disputes over ontology are inseparable from our concrete daily existence.